Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are going to go through the first lesson of a course on bioethics. And the first um, lesson is going to be about the context. And the context that we're living in is a context that's known as postmodernity. And, uh, and that needs to be taken into consideration as we confront bioethics. In the postmodern era, it seems that people can choose their sexuality more or less to their liking, and it would seem that nothing is natural or even unnatural. Sex and sexuality, life, even death, seem like concepts made personal, subjective, reduced to mere questions of taste. As we know, tastes essentially are changeable. You can change your taste. You can you can mutate. There's growth, change in taste. But as we know, uh, something is awry when you have a sense of change all the time. People need to have a sense of stability. They need to have something that they identify that is constant and stable. And who pays the most consequences for this problem are the children, because all drifts that come from such thought have an effect on them. Uh, they have become the last major consumer good for the person who has everything. Just think of the phenomenon of the rented uterus, the uterus that the surrogate motherhood, or the various artificial fertilization techniques or experiments on embryos, etc. All of these are experiments with change that in the end have affected children, and we don't know the consequences even with the children that are now with us. We will know the consequences later when they become adolescents, when they become adults. This hedonistic mentality derives the current ease with which our society gets rid of so many children by means of abortion. At the same time, it is frantically committed to creating children. This is the logic of the markets. So we are very well aware, for example, in the United States, of people going across the border to have a baby the way they want to have the baby. So they want the baby to be blonde and blue-eyed, and certain height, a certain taste, a certain way. They choose the baby according to their own desires and pleasures. They don't see the baby as a gift from God. Peter Singer delights in pushing the boundaries of the ethically lawful, for instance. He says, not so long ago, any form of sexuality not leading to the conception of children was seen as, at best, wanton, lust, or worse, perversion. One by one, the taboos have fallen. The idea that it could be wrong to use contraception in order to separate sex from reproduction is now merely quaint. And on this issue, I want to read something to you that stems from essentially an understanding of how things develop and change. What sounds essentially absurd today may sound normal in 20 years. And this can be seen by what has happened in the last 100 years. In the 1920s, for instance, abortion was legalized in Bolshevik Russia. One has but to think of Alexandra Kollontai, who pushed for women's liberation from the family, working to separate the sexual act from procreation. Margaret Sanger brought these ideas and practices to the United States in a time when contraception was still unthinkable. In fact, it was the Lambeth Council in 1928 that liberalized contraception in the Anglican Communion. Pope Pius XI replied against this with his Casti Connubii on December 31st, 1930. 40 years later, not only was contraception socially acceptable, but so was divorce and abortion. What Alexander Kollontai had pushed in Bolshevik Russia in the 1920s was common in the United States and much of Europe in the 1970s. Of course, it did not stop here. The very nature of marriage would change so that what was unthinkable in the 1970s became quite thinkable on June 26, 2015, when the Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court case in America declared marriage between two persons of the same sex legal. Evidently, in simply 40 years, 2 generations, a lot can change. One is also to think of the 1990s with euthanasia. Dr. Kevorkian was considered a monster by most people. He was commonly called Dr. Death. Much of what he wanted to do, however, has been accomplished because in 2024, euthanasia cases are on the rise everywhere. This slippery, slow process is called the Overton window. It confirms to us that there is no compromising with evil. There is no lesser evil, something which Pius XI makes clear in his encyclical. The natural course of events will lead either to life or to death, depending on the principles. If the principles are integrally good, then we shall have the fruits of life, a culture of life. If the principles are not entirely good, then we shall have the fruits of death, a culture of death. This is what we are witnessing before our very eyes today. And this happens with the laws. So, for example, today we have the constitutional laws in France that they put into constitution the abortion, and now they're trying to do this in Europe as well. And it has an implication of how laws are understood. It is no longer law as the justice at the basis of law, of the lex, but law in just a positive sense of law. With the Hobbesian, this is a Hobbesian understanding of law that we understand in terms of the law as auctoritas non veritas facit legem, that the authority, not the truth, is what makes the law. And so we have the reversal of two main faculties, the intellect and the will. It is no longer jus quia justum, but simply a law because someone or some powerful group wants it. So the changes come with the whim of the will of people that are in power. It is no longer the intellect that governs the real, for example, that the unborn child is a person, and moves the will accordingly, for example, to make it so that we must respect the life of this child, but it is the other way around. What the will desires, for example, to kill the child in the womb, the intellect ratifies as good. For example, that abortion is the right. It is the law of the jungle, but passed in parliament. It is the bellum omnium contra omnes of Hobbes, the war of all against all. And who wins? Well, in such a case, the strongest, not the most just. And so in the case of abortion, the adult wins against the child, the one who is already developed against the one who's still undeveloped, the one who can actualize certain abilities against the one who is not yet able to do so, the one who is healthy against the sick. What Peter Singer said about infanticide is next, not to mention pedophilia. If one thinks that this is not the direction in which we are heading, that one person has a lot to start thinking about. So, what are we to do in this situation? Well, we have to consider that truth has the last word because it reflects adequately what reality is. What is true is not what is ideological. It is here that we must begin our thought and our resistance of this dictatorship of relativism. And we see, for instance, that what Peter Singer stresses in this dictatorship is that he says the ultimate taboo is bestiality. And there's nothing special in this sense about human beings or their sexual acts that makes bestiality problematic. So you see, with the wrong premises, you'll get these kinds of consequences, these kinds of conclusions. And so I think what's important is to keep, indeed, the focus on what is true. And with that, you won't get conclusions like, the ultimate taboo is bestiality, which might be the case today, but not tomorrow. Many observations could be made to these ideas and their authors, but in the bioethical dialectic, things are increasingly difficult. The reductio ad absurdum, which shows how false a position is by extracting the manifestly absurd logical conclusions, no longer works in bioethics and in sexual ethics, because it also seems that what is unnatural or unreasonable has its academic supporters and journalists. So what's happening here is that there's a disconnection between conceptions of the human person. After decades in society of disconnecting our conceptions of the human person, sexuality, fertility, relationship from human nature, community, culture, tradition, we are now hardly able to stand up to anything, no matter how perverse. On this note, I would like to recommend to you a book by Roger Scruton called On Human Nature, in which he emphasizes this relationship, this connectivity between sexuality, fertility, relationship, culture, community, tradition. All of these elements come together, because when you have a disconnected person, it's going to be much easier to abuse that person. If it's a connected, integral person, it's going to be much harder for certain people to take advantage of others. Today we have this consumerist obsession with freedom of the parts from each other, freedom as an end of itself. But freedom, we must understand, is limited by the nature of the thing. If we look at family, for instance, we look at the polls, we can see that people are now less inclined than a generation ago to consider sexual fidelity, marriage or life, marriage for life, parenting and caring for children and the elderly as personal goals. Motherhood is no longer seen as a constitutive part of femininity or as the fatherhood of masculinity. So this is where you see Alexandra Kollontai, who really was able to get this into the system, the Marxist system, where the mother needs to be working, where the mother should not be in the family, but should be in the factory. And the same goes for the father. So the family, in this sense, is also being disintegrated, separated. Terms such as self-sacrifice, obligation, and fall out of use in the vocabulary used by modern liberal societies. These terms have been replaced by discourses on autonomy, life choices, rights, preferences, and there's the disintegration of the whole family unit. The crisis in this is in the sense of commitment, self-sacrifice. This has brought consequences to vocations, not only to the priesthood religious life, but also to marriage and parenthood. It is clear to everyone how marriages have decreased in favor of a much less demanding cohabitation. We are faced with a civilization that renounces a marriage, family, commitment, self-sacrifice, in which the value of commitment to the community has been lost. All of this is a contraceptive or anti-life culture. The idea has been spreading that having many children is irresponsible, especially when it comes to poor families. In the West, this message is conveyed in some ways, in very subtle ways. For example, the looks of the people you have if you have several children with you. Children who are often unwelcome in restaurants, sometimes even in people's homes and in churches. Often in the modern mentality, we see how sexuality must be safe from children, quote unquote, safe from children. What this is achieved is a sterilization of sex, and demonization of children. In a contraceptive or anti-life culture, we are indoctrinated not only to love our body, life, and children, and to fear our fertility, without withholding it even from our spouses, cauterizing it temporarily or permanently. As this process continues, our civilization is literally becoming sterile. So this is all a culture of death. A change of mindset, in the sense, a metanoia, is needed, which eradicates a closed, selfish, mature, hedonistic mentality. There are various nuances of this culture of death. Campaigns for euthanasia are relentless right now in the West. The task of caring for the elderly, the disabled, the dying is particularly challenging in a world increasingly prone to discriminate against people or even kill such people. So proponents of such deadly practices know well how to disguise them as respect for rights, mercy for the incurable, efficient use of resources. We know that rights talk begins with Hobbes, but it is ironic that the Hobbesian system is exactly that which impedes rights from becoming possible. If we look at a Catholic engagement with this life of postmodernity and with its anthropological foundation, we have some answers. The past century itself has seen a flowering of Catholic thinking on sexuality, marriage, and family life, from married lay theologians as much as popes. In 1965, the Second Vatican Council identified among the emerging threats to marriage and family, divorce, promiscuity, self-obsession, hedonism, contraception, abortion, economic, social, and psychological pressures in the campaign against overpopulation. So you can look at Gaudium et Spes 46 and 47 on these points. So the place of sexuality and fertility in the vocation of marriage is very important, as we see in Gaudium et Spes verse number 4. Never before has man had so keen understanding of freedom, yet at the same time, new forms of social and psychological slavery make their appearance. A world where the explosion of rights, Hobbesian rights talk, has ushered in what some critics call a duty-free society. And man says that the people float without a map on a raft of different choices, rudderless and alone in a sea of freedom, the absence of God or tradition. Clearly that loneliness, the depression, the sadness is because they're alone, because they don't have an objective. Phil Lawler observed that the public consequence of private sexual behavior may now threaten to destroy American society, I would say Western society. So all that is private is really public in many ways. It seems private, but it has an effect, it has a public effect. And man observes that if we trace the course of history and go looking for the origins of contemporary culture, wars, euthanasia, abortion, divorce, we usually arrive at the clash between the sovereign and autonomous self ideal, which expresses individual rights to freedom and self-determination, and an obligated self-ideal, which emphasizes interdependence, connectedness, and limits to freedom, where actions are constrained by consequences for others. We're reminded in Genesis chapter 2 that the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may eat freely of the tree of the garden, But if the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day that you eat of it, you shall die. What's interesting about this is that what is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Well, it is the knowledge of the good and evil that is merely natural, like natural science. And the knowledge, though, of God is above that. It's not just fixed on that tree. There's many trees. There's a sense, there's a larger picture. There's a spiritual vision to understanding all of knowledge. And what the temptation does is it focuses us entirely on ourselves, on science, on the limits, essentially. And it doesn't allow us to look at the knowledge of the wisdom of God. And so taking God out of the picture, everything else falls apart in the society. And that's what we're seeing right now. With this imagery, essentially, Revelation teaches that the power to decide what is good and evil does not belong to man, but to God alone. Man is certainly free in as much as he can understand, accept God's commands. And he possesses an extremely far-reaching freedom, since he can eat of every tree of the garden. But his freedom is not unlimited. It must halt before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for it is called to accept moral law given by God. In fact, freedom finds its authentic, complete fulfillment precisely in the acceptance of that law. God, who alone is good, knows perfectly what is good for man, and by virtue of this very love, proposes this good to man in the commandments. God's law does not reduce, much less do away with, human freedom. Rather, it protects and promotes that freedom. This comes from Veritatis Splendor 35, a beautiful text of Pope John Paul II on the moral law. Sacred scripture is also one of the elements that's being discussed. One of the main consequences, in fact, of the Second Vatican Council was that undoubtedly its insistence that Catholics pay more attention to the Bible. For complete knowledge, it is necessary to add readings and to deal with the topics of the post-biblical Christian tradition, including the councils, the fathers, the scholastics, the magisterium, who offer some and authoritative readings of the scriptural texts. What this does is it emphasizes that revelation has a point. Revelation, which is a higher knowledge, has to be considered. And it doesn't contradict the lesser knowledges, rather it confirms them in itself. Starting with Leo XIII at the end of the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, we are witnessing a Thomistic revival, which is very helpful because there's a structure in Thomas that helps our thoughts get put into place. Authors such as Germain Grisey, John Finnis, William May, Joseph Boyle, Robert George, Patrick Lee have argued that life and death and marriage and family are among the basic human goods, or reasons for human action, along with the friendship, creativity, leisure, beauty, knowledge, religion, and integrity. Equally fundamental, intrinsically good, each good should be reverenced in every life. None should ever be directly chosen against. As John Paul II wrote in Veritatis Splendor, the new evangelization will show its authenticity and unleash all its missionary force when it is carried out through the gift not only of the word proclaimed, but also the word lived. Lived. In particular, the life of the holiness which is resplendent in so many members of the people of God, humble and often unseen. The life of holiness thus brings to full expression and effectiveness the threefold and unitary munus propheticum, sacerdotale, praedicale, which every Christian receives as a gift by being born again of water and the Spirit in baptism. Thank you for your attention on this first point of our context for bioethics today.